have lower carbon footprint and lower burning of release of carbon dioxide and other emissions, that is the way to go. And that means renewable energy, because renewable energy emits no or very, very low air pollutants. So this, of course, leads to health and lesser of climate change issues. Mainly also, India has committed to generate 40% of energy from non-fossil fuels by 2030 in the Paris Agreement. And the target is 175 gigawatt by 2022. This is defined by MNRE, and 450 gigawatts by 2030. Now, which are the 5 renewables which are actively under consideration by MNRE or the Ministry of New and Renewable Energies is solar, geothermal, biomass, hydropower, and wind. But below is also the word oceans, which is what I will be talking to you about today. So in general, from the oceans, if you want to harness energy, you can do it from waves, you can do it from currents, you can do it from the thermal gradient. And we did have a wave energy plant on a demonstration mode very long ago in Kerala. And this was at one point the only working wave energy project in the world. But, eventually this has not really taken off, as I'll show you later. Our priorities changed towards desalination more. So this was now finally, we actually, after we finished all the experiments there, we decommissioned it, and we are now into floating wave powered devices. This is called the backward bend ducted buoy, which actually also several times we have tested offshore, and this has generated energy several times. But the genesis of this object here, the wave powered navigational buoy, was in the floating wave energy device, which I showed you earlier. Now, every Indian port and harbor needs what are called navigational buoys to mark the entry into the channel by the large ships. So these buoys, many of them are still being imported, and they are also using solar panels. What we have made here, the picture you see on the right, the orange colored buoy, we have made it look exactly like the ones that they are used currently, but this is actually operating using wave energy, and it has some value additions that we have added current sensors and wind sensor on it, and the data actually comes into the mobiles of several people. So people sitting in the shore station, the signal station in the port can actually get the data at their hand of what is happening when the ship is entering the port, the actual currents over there and the actual wind seen over there, which is probably a few nautical miles away from the entry to the port. So this technology has been transferred to industry, and this is already actually a proven technology. We've also been working on marine currents. There are a lot of tidal streams, and the currents in India are fairly low around the coast, but there are a lot of tidal streams, and this was done in Andaman. We have actually demonstrated this off-grid, what we call hydrokinetic turbine, which actually runs using the velocity of the water. So in fact, there is a lot of demand for this in places like Andaman, where there are people sitting in darkness without water. It is a security prone area, so there are a lot of forest small security areas where renewable energies are needed. And in fact, they're asking us for 1 to 5 kilowatt units of off-grid power using these hydrokinetic turbines. Why I'm specifically saying this is, when you talk about power, people generally tend to think that unless you make a megawatt of power or something, it is of no use. We just absolutely don't agree to that. There are lots of small requirements at various locations in the country which require small off-grid units, and that also of renewables. So this is one technology that we have developed, which will certainly have its place and which is going to be very useful in the future. Then there is another form of ocean energy, which is called the ocean thermal energy conversion. So all around the globe, if you see these areas, these are the regions where the surface sea temperature is always warm, and the Southeast Asian countries and the Pacific countries, all of them also have these temperatures at the surface. However, this is the way the temperature profile is in the ocean. Though the surface temperatures, as I showed you in the world map, they are warm through the year. The temperature actually drops as you start going downwards deeper into the ocean. And somewhere at around 1,000-meter water depth, you can even get 7 to 8 degrees Celsius of water. So this temperature gradient, the difference in the temperature between the surface of the sea and the deep ocean, this actually can be used to generate power. This is called the ocean temperature gradient. What basically happens here is that warm water vaporizes a low boiling point fluid. This vapor drives a turbine. The vapor again passes through a condenser or a heat exchanger where the cold water from the deep sea is passed, and therefore it sort of condenses again. This becomes a closed cycle continuously, and the turbine keeps generating power. This is called the OTEC cycle. So having said that, now these were said in the context of the climate change and why we need to go to renewables. You're already aware of the solar PV and wind and biomass and the standard forms of energy. I thought I should introduce you to these new forms of ocean energy, which have got, which can pave the way towards having a clean, fossil-free, based carbon emission-free kind of an environment if you use ocean energy. The reason to use ocean energy in India is that we have a really large coastline and a huge exclusive economic zone, and therefore it makes sense to work on ocean energy areas. On the other hand, there is also a lot of potential for the future for ocean energy utilization, not necessarily only like because it is a renewable energy we need to go about it. It has a huge market opportunity. It's especially good for isolated island communities. It can be used for desalination, mining, aquaculture, underwater vehicles, and observations. What I told you, we have a set of data points. So all power requirements offshore could be met with ocean energy. And that's the way we need to focus our research with a multi-purpose kind of an idea. So now let me come to the water stress. Essentially, we have been talking about greenhouse gases and climate change. Now, how is climate change and water related? Or is there a relation at all? Does climate change lead to water stress? So let's try to understand that a little bit. Basically, there is a water stress today in the country that is very well known. There is unavailability of fresh water or water scarcity. So what are the reasons? Largely, what are the reasons? Reduction of per capita availability because of the huge population. There's a severe pollution of rivers and lakes and contamination of groundwater. And there's over exploitation of groundwater, and there's also poor management practices. Now, these are the overall points to sort of worry about when you're looking at it in the Indian context and trying to understand water stress. However, climate change is also a culprit, and it's also a factor in the water stress that is resulting. And let me tell you how. One is that the climate change's big impact is on the hydrological cycle itself, okay? Because of the global warming and the changes thereof, the impact is on the hydrological cycle. So what is happening is the wet areas are getting wetter, the dry ones are getting drier. So where it's already generally flooding, more floods are occurring. Where it is dry, it is getting more and more arid. There are more severe weathers occurring many more times than before. And the sea level rise and storm surges and floods are a big result. And then, of course, it all affects the total availability of water as a water resource for fresh water. And the actual original underlying reasons are anyway population and industrial growth. But these impacts on the hydrological cycle are actually affecting large water bodies, and therefore the water stress is just continuously increasing. Now, if you look at the climate change aspects and the implication on water resources, if you see these are the issues that are happening. Sea level rise, precipitation, saltwater intrusion. Now, basically, there is an increasing temperature kind of a scenario, which leads to transpiration, and therefore, obviously, water quality gets affected. There is a change in the precipitation patterns. I could even tell you of late, I live in Chennai and we only are supposed to get the northeast monsoons. We never get any rain in the southwest monsoons. Actually, all these years we have been living here. This year, starting from June, it has been continuously raining. This is very unusual. This is not the season for it over here at all. So this, in turn has implications on the crops and, the lifestyle and the actual the diseases, and it has got such a large spectrum of things associated that every change that is happening has got implications tenfold. So because of the change in precipitation patterns, the stream flows, water availability, everything changes, and the areas of regions which are affected and not affected all kind of start getting very mixed up. There is the intensity, frequency, and magnitude of floods and droughts is changing. As I said, very high floods and very high droughts, both are happening. The groundwater recharge is not happening uniformly as it should, because it rains when it shouldn't and it is not raining when it should. And of course, at the sea level, at the coast, these are the most affected because there is salinity intrusion and there is also inundation happening because of the sea level rise. So again, coming back to the scenario of climate change and water stress, nearly all emission scenarios predict decreased availability of renewable surface and groundwater sources. So these scenarios, when you a lot of work has been done on these emission scenarios, and there is actually, they all predict that has got an effect on the surface and groundwater resources. So each degree of global warming is projected to decrease the availability by at least 20%, okay, for every 7% of global population. And then there's a reduction in the diluting capacity of water. Thus the eutrophication and deoxygenation levels also, deoxygenation also starts occurring. So overall, the climate change has got a very high connect with water and leads to tremendous water issues and water stress. And in general, largely, this is actually the sources from the UN Environment for Climate Change Adaptation for Water. And it talks about 6 large areas. Too much water, what happens? Too little water, what is happening? We need to have water allocation, water augmentation in these areas. There are some hazard and risk assessments and vulnerability which we don't even know. There are unknown climate risks which we are yet to understand and yet to know. So we are suddenly having more and more disasters, as I told you earlier, flooding and drought and things. So we need to have preparedness, and therefore the disaster response warnings, all that become very important. And then we have the sea level rise. So that is leading to, again, saltwater intrusion. You have to have shoreline protective measures. You need to have mitigating measures so that the infrastructure is protected. Overall, there are so many issues happening, and of course water pollution, so non-availability to drink, and overall so many things are happening that one of the main things is which is the water stress, that is too little water, really needs serious addressing in a environmentally friendly way. Okay, so let me tell you how essentially in this particular thing, when you talk about too little water, you can see what we are calling about these bullets that you see here: water allocation, water augmentation, water efficiency and demand management, water storage, and alternative water sources. So I've been on I'm on several committees for water, and in one of these we have prepared a document on actually the issues related to climate change and water, and we finally categorized it into 3 categories. One is conservation, management, and then there's augmentation. See, everybody, there are always people who say all this newfangled methods and technologies are of no use. You have to just do conservation, that is water harvesting and things like that, and that should be enough. No, there is no doubt that we must do rainwater harvesting, we must conserve water, we must not waste water. But there are also issues that there is no, that is very well said, and we don't disagree with that. However, that much water, by doing that, it's not going to be sufficient. When you talk about management, yes, we need to have serious relooks at all our piping distribution networks and try to use IoT and make things more efficient. However, with all this, the rising demand for water is so much that this is just not going to be enough, and therefore we need to augment it. So how do we augment water? One is the standard way of trying to treat wastewater, and about 80% of the domestic water use is converted into wastewater, as all of us know. Now, barring the black water, which is the feces and the sewage, a lot of it, is called gray water, and this includes the wastewater from bathrooms and washing machines, etc. So, if this gray water is treated, about 30 to 40% of saving of water can happen. So many of the water resources are contaminated with such wastewater, and therefore the water in available water sources are also not usable because of this wastewater getting mixed. So if we treat the wastewater in the gated communities where many of us live today, where I live, we have found that after the treatment and reusing it in the flush, we are saving 40% of the water. So that can be used for, like more frequent pumping and things like that. Industries are the water hoggers, as you say, about 15% gets used by them. But there are a lot of very bad effluents, and therefore we need to really have mitigating and treatment kind of measures. Where today zero liquid discharge is being talked about a lot. That is very difficult to achieve, but we must go that way and make the fresh water usable back to the industries. So, having said all that, even with whatever you do, by 2030, the Indian water demand will be about 1.5 trillion cubic meter. Okay. Currently 700 to 800 billion cubic meter. This is simply not enough. And therefore, one large water producing methodology or augmentative approach is desalination. And in Indian, as I told you before, this map is important. The green areas is the exclusive economic zone. We also have a bunch of islands in the Bay of Bengal as well as in the Arabian Sea. And therefore, we have a huge EEZ and also a long coastline. Therefore, seawater desalination makes sense. Distillation membrane and various all these. But just a small aside is that there are two large ways to sort of look at desalination. The technology is thermal and membrane. Thermal are the ones that is using steam in power plants like multi-stage flash, etc. The membrane technologies, or the RO, the reverse osmosis, which is most popular today, well, that though it is really useful for brackish water, I would think seawater desalination, we still need to be wary about that. Though Chennai itself has two large RO desalination, 100 mld and 150 mld plants here in Chennai. There is a lot of brine discharge, and there is also no seawater membrane still indigenously manufactured. There are a lot of possible ecological and environmental impacts. So,
Purnima ma'am, sorry to interrupt you. There is some disturbance. We're not able to hear you, ma'am.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am. The volume is quite low, I think. Anil sir is...
The mic is far away. How about now?
Ma'am, better, but not...
Hello? Shall I continue?
Yes, ma'am. Please, you may continue, please.
Yeah. So, because I have only 5 more minutes in any case. So, basically, this is the Lakshadweep Kavaratti Island. And we have developed a technology which is called the low temperature thermal desalination. And this is a very, very simple technology. All of you know that water boils on the gas at about 100 degrees Celsius in atmospheric pressure. What we do is we can take a vessel, take 28 degrees water, keep it in vacuum, and that will still boil at 28 degrees itself. That's exactly what we are doing here. We are passing the surface seawater through a container which is in vacuum, and the vapor gets condensed through a heat exchanger where the colder deep sea water is passed, and this continuously generates fresh water of very high quality. So this is the Kavaratti plant that we put up in 2005. This is the first time ever anybody has done this in the world, and we developed a lot of new things for this technology. You can see the islanders happy here. So actually this was a very successful project, and for islands actually this was they did not even have good quality water to drink every day, and they were constantly falling sick because of dysentery and various other water related diseases. So this has become the main source of drinking water, and the health has improved, and it is very simple to operate. So local islanders with 8th standard pass kind of kids are actually running this plant. For NIOT, of course, this was an engineering translated to societal benefit. So we are very happy with this, and there a lot of complex challenges which we had addressed. So we are very proud of this plant. Subsequently, because of the success, we put up 2 more plants, one in Agatti and Minicoy, and till date, after 16 years also, still there is absolutely no environmental impact. We scaled this up and showed this on a barge at offshore of Chennai in deep waters, 40 kilometers from the shore. This is what it looked like. And the same thing as when you talk about climate change and thermal pollution and things like that, this technology can be also used to create fresh water and remediate the environment in a power plant kind of scenario by reducing the outlet temperatures. In India, all power plants discharge a lot of hot water, and this actually, by doing this technology within the power plants, using the effluent from the power plant, the hot water that is let out from the power plant, we can generate fresh water. So it does not need steam. You can generate the power plant's requirements within the power plant premises itself with very little footprint. And as the water leaves, the temperature will be lowered. So this can be actually used instead of cooling towers. Okay. So the components of desalination, this depicts all the main components of desalination. And essentially the main thing that one would see that is important is energy. Okay, so here we come back to green and clean energy that we're talking about today. That energy can be used renewables for this, for doing desalination. So essentially, there are systems slowly coming in place like irrigation using solar pumps, RO using solar PV and things like that. But ideally now we should do desalination, which is environmentally friendly. An environmentally friendly technology of desalination could be used along with renewable energy to make it really a sustainable system. So this I showed you before. We had this wave energy plant, which was actually powering an RO plant. So this was the first time we had done this in the world. We have also designed a solar desalination system along with DST and a private enterprise at Ramanathapuram, and this makes desalinated water using multi-effect distillation, but powered by solar thermal. Right now, this is the last of my slide. We are right now actually planning to have, as you know, in the islands already 3 are having those plants, and then 6 more also we are putting the same technology, but they're all using diesel generators. And as you know, diesel generators, again, because of being a fossil fuel, is prone to contamination and will lead to climate change. And therefore, we are trying to now go the other way to avoid using diesel generators. So we are going to power these desalination systems using the OTEC power, which I showed earlier. So this will be the first OTEC powered desalination system that we're trying out. So for that, we have developed a laboratory in our campus where we run these experiments for optimization. We are going back to the Kavaratti Island, and this will have new challenges, like this will have the longest cold water pipe, and it will also have the first indigenously designed and fabricated turbine. This time we will make OTEC power to power the desalination without using diesel generators. But we are not, because this is the first plant, we are not promising any power to the grid. We will just make enough power to power the desalination system. So oceans can be a solution for green energy and clean water. And by going in this direction, we can mitigate the climate change and global warming effects. So renewable energies is a must, in which oceans also can contribute, and clean water using safe desalination technologies also is important, using renewable energies. Thank you very, very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Purnima, for sparing time for being with us. It was a wonderful and insightful presentation, madam. Thank you once again. With this note, I would request the participants, if they are with any query or any question, they can write to us in the chat box, and even they can raise their hands, for which I will unmute them and they can directly put up their question to Dr. Purnima. Madam, I can see one question in the chat box. Madam, please elaborate the logic of wet areas and why receive more rainfall and while arid regions receive less rainfall, by Mr. DG.
Yeah, so this is because of the climate change aspects which I was talking about. This is what is happening. This is a result of the climate change, which is happening because of the global warming. So there are dry areas, and those are not, like I said, the monsoons and the rainfalls is all becoming actually like the patterns are not being followed. So where it should rain, it has not been raining, and therefore those are becoming drier. And those where you should actually, when you like I told you, the Chennai season right now, I mean, it is raining nearly every day here. This is not when we are suppose our lakes are like already about 70% full. Actually, the lakes become full only in the northeast monsoon. So you see, if there are some places in the country where, or in the world also, where it rains more than it should, and it starts flooding, whereas the other areas are getting drier. These are all the impacts of climate change and global warming. That's what I was trying to say.
Thank you, Dr. Purnima. Ma'am, the next question we have is by Zareen Singh. The question is, why have more desalination plants being not installed despite of being very useful?
Pardon, can you repeat that?
Yes, ma'am. The question we have is by Zareen Singh. The question is, why don't we have more desalination plants installed?
Why do we or don't we?
Why don't we have?
That's because we have still not taken off in the technology. Really, we are trying to get more desal. In fact, like places like Chennai, where there's been a serious water problem, we have 2 RO-based desalination plants already. Gujarat has a couple of desalination plants. First of all, large seawater desalination plants is what I'm talking about. So those can be only at the coast. And see, Kerala always has a lot of water, so they don't need. Mumbai also has got a sufficient amount of water. So the east coast is where we need, and now slowly people are getting into this mode of trying to get into desalination. It has come quite recently only to India. There are some, I've not got all those slides here to show me, but I have the entire list of various desalination plants which are being put up in India, but it is still quite a low number, and also there is more emphasis on reverse osmosis or RO, and mostly for brackish water.
Ma'am, the next question is by Mr. Salim. The question is, what is OTEC estimated capacity of India?
Well, actually, rough cut by earlier estimates, they say it is 180,000 megawatts. Okay, so it's like but a rough estimate which is calculated. See, we have to look at it from how many modules will be there in what area, and those kind of things. So in general, it can lead to huge number of gigawatts of power for the country.
Thank you, madam. The next question is by Mr. Tinu. The question is impacts of RO plants.
What about RO plants?
Impacts He wants to discuss the impacts of RO plants.
I didn't get the question.
Impacts.
Okay. Yeah. There are a lot of impacts of RO plants. I can give you a separate lecture on that. But in short, I can tell you, one is that, there is a huge amount of brine formation. Now you will ask, every desalination plant will have that. It is not that way. For instance, our plant, there is the thermodynamic efficiency. For those who are physicists, the thermodynamic efficiency is only 1%, which means out of every 100 liters that you draw inside the plant, only 1 liter gets transformed to fresh water. So the 99 liters goes back to the sea, and that means the sea water doesn't get changed at all. Whereas in the RO, about 40 to 50% of the water is converted to thick solid brine. Okay, I mean, not solid, very thick slurry of brine. So that can, make the seawater more salty. Okay, then that impacts the ecological and surroundings, all this up to the small phytoplankton. This can impact. And then the other thing is, the membranes are totally not really degradable. Okay, see, structurally, if you have to pass 16 bar pressure through them, structurally they have to be extremely strong. So it's very, very difficult to destroy the membranes once the 2-year life is over. In fact, in Saudi, what people are doing is they're using those membranes to build compound walls, because they just cannot be destroyed. So there are a lot of other impacts also because of the resultant brine discharge and the way the membranes function and things that it needs a lot of pre-processing chemicals, post-processing chemicals, and all these get discharged to the sea. There are a huge number of things which make RO not a very friendly desalination methodology.
Thank you, Dr. Purnima. These were all the questions of the participants. And thank you once again for addressing the questions so patiently.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now moving towards the second session, we have Ms. Vaishnavi Shankar to explore on the topic mainstreaming urban resilience across Indian cities. Ms. Vaishnavi is the lead of Training and Capacity Building, Climate Center for Cities, National Institute of Urban Affairs. Here, Vaishnavi's work focuses on strengthening local capacities for adopting climate measures. She has earlier worked with Mahila Housing Seva Trust, India Habitat Forum, and Center for Conservation Studies, CEPT University. Vaishnavi is a Chevening Scholar and holds a master's degree in Urbanisation and Development from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and a bachelor degree in Architecture from BMS College of Engineering, Bangalore. We are pleased to have you, Ms. Vaishnavi. A very hearty welcome to you. May I please request you to kindly proceed with your session. Ms. Vaishnavi, over to you.
Thank you, Nitika. Thank you so much for the introduction. Are you able to hear me clearly?
Yes, you're very audible.
All right. Let me just go ahead and share my screen. Just also let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes, your presentation is visible.
All right, great. So thank you, Nitika, once again, and good afternoon to everyone. You're able to see the presentation?
Yes, your presentation is visible and it is in full mood. You may continue, please.
All right, okay, fine, yeah. So I would like to thank NIDM and the Mahatma Gandhi State Institute of Public Administration for inviting me for this particular training, and all of the participants who joined this afternoon. So in my presentation today, of course, I'll be focusing on urban resilience across Indian cities. And to begin with, I'll be taking you all through the climate vulnerability, especially in the cities, and also focus on why it is important to build resilience in cities in particular. And then I'll cover the concept of what resilience is, and also illustrate an example of how a city can develop a resilience strategy, and followed by some other global and maybe some of the national examples also as to how you can strengthen some projects that you're doing by mainstreaming resilience within that. And just before we close, I will very briefly touch upon the Climate Smart Cities Assessment Framework, This is a one of its kind assessment that the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs has initiated to assess the development of cities from a climate lens. So I'll get into a little bit more details on this as we proceed. So before we begin, I think our previous speaker has also mentioned about the disasters, but maybe I can just again quickly refresh your memory on the number of disasters that in India alone we have faced, and just focusing on 2020 last year, the kind of disasters that the country had to experience. And this is, of course, in addition to the ongoing pandemic. So we had cyclones on the East Coast, on the West Coast, and floods. And the Hyderabad floods also towards the end of the year, which was very new that the city had never experienced. So the number of disasters, of course, are only increasing. And in recent time, the flash floods in Himachal Pradesh and the landslide in Uttarakhand, and also very recently at a global scale, the heat waves that swept Canada, which also proved very fatal for the country, is something as a recent reminder for us to say that the disasters are only increasing in its frequency and in its severity. And that is something is of very importance to keep in mind. Here, if we have to look at the climate vulnerability of the country, because this is going to be our new normal in a sense, and it's very important to understand the vulnerability aspect of our country and the cities specifically. So India is ranked as the 10th most vulnerable country in the world, according to the Global Climate Risk Index. And this has been varying from 7th to 10th in the last 3 years. And if you see the map, this is mostly the smart cities that have been mapped. And this is the aggregate hazard risk of each of the cities. And here we've looked at heat wave, flooding, and cyclone per se. So depending on all of these three hazards together, we've kind of mapped their hazard risk sort of profile for each of the cities. And you see that the majority of the cities that are marked in red have a high risk to these disasters. So the reason we've also picked only this is part of another study that we're doing, and we picked only heat wave, flooding, and cyclone, also because this is something that is going to increase more frequently in India. So of course, heat wave is estimated to increase by 75 times if we continue as business as usual scenario. And flooding, this is something I'm sure each one of us have experienced, either flooding or water stagnation very recently. So I'm speaking from Delhi. So in Delhi also, we've been having continuous rains, and this also leads to water stagnation and flooding in certain parts of the cities. So, and in India alone, we have over 140 cities that are prone to high risk of flooding. And when we talk about the coastal, we have a very large coast and many cities on the coastal belt as well, with some of the dense cities, which is like Bombay, Calcutta, Chennai, Kochi, Visakhapatnam, and all of these cities, of course, are prone to frequent cyclones. So that is also something that we have to keep in mind. And if I have to quote, as per the IPCC, the 1.50-degree report, it clearly says that in India, the projected cyclones and the storms are only going to increase annually. And even the heat waves, the occurrence of that is also going to increase, is something that has been mentioned again and again. And if I have to draw this back to the context of India, in India, we talk about monsoons, we project everything based on monsoons. So if we have to allocate make sense of it with respect to monsoons, then that IPCC report also says that the projections of monsoons is going to be very, very erratic because of the climate change. And this will have many, many effects that I think currently all of us are also facing, with continuous rains and things like that across the country per se. So what I'm trying to say from these two slides is there are 2 points that we have to keep in mind. One is that the is in number and in its intensity. That is something that we have to keep in mind. And the second point is that the in general, the changing weather itself. So we may have a more number of days with higher average temperature or higher average precipitation levels. So in addition to disasters, just the changing weather patterns is also something that we have to start building resilience to and start adapting to. So one is we've just spoken about the kind of disasters that we experience and also the changing weather. But if we have to come down to talking about cities and how they also in a way contribute to climate change, that is also of importance because cities are not only getting impacted by these disasters and the climate change, but in a way they're also contributing to it. So more and more now what we see, cities are becoming the platform to address climate change. And this is for several reasons. One is, of course, the scale of urbanization in our country and the economic significance of the cities. So we are estimated to support more than 40% of our country's population and contribute to more than 75% of the national GDP by 2030. So the amount of people, the number of people who are coming to cities, and that is with respect to people, but then also with respect to the investments and the assets and the development that is going to happen, and the contribution to GDP, especially in cities, is also going to increase. And considering all of the changes, the disasters, it becomes more and more important for us to start focusing on cities and build more resilience towards it. So while we're projected to grow in most of our cities, like I said earlier, the cities are also experiencing a lot of disasters. So just to again reiterate some of the points, in 2020, we had 10 cities in India which experienced a lot of flooding. And in 2019, we had like 8 Indian cities which were ranked as the 15 hottest places on earth. So again, these are just numbers to emphasize what we're heading towards and what we need to basically start adopting to build these changes per se. So a few more points on this particular slide with respect to cities is also that globally, although cities occupy only 3% of the land space, it is estimated that the cities generate 70% of the carbon emissions. In addition to urbanization, in addition to the economic importance, what cities are also doing is contributing to the greenhouse gas emissions, which does trigger the climate change. And in return, it comes back as a cycle to impact the cities in itself. So also in the latest IPCC report, it was clearly mentioned that for the first time, without any doubt, that the climate change that's happening is sort of exacerbated by the human intervention and the development, the kind of development path that we've chosen. So there is no doubt that that is something we have to start addressing if we want to like address and mitigate the climate change risks per se. And in this particular context, I'm going to emphasize again that cities, which are the centers of commerce, business, trade, and society, and the dense population that we have, it becomes more and more important that we save the loss of lives, we safeguard our investments and the development, and in general, our economic growth, so we can sort of like survive and grow irrespective of the kind of disasters and the changes that we are bound to experience. So we've spoken quite a bit about climate change, the disasters, and the importance of cities. But if I have to just go a little more deeper with respect to cities and how they function, in as an overall sort of a concept, what we can say is cities basically are a complex web of institutions, infrastructure, information, people in that sense. So what you see on your screen and what was also highlighted in a sense are these things. So when we talk about institutions in a city, there's a transport department, there's a housing department, there's an IMD department, the Disaster Management Authority, Pollution Control Board. So there are many institutions that work on various aspects in a particular city. And of course, we have our infrastructure, which is our roads, our metros, we have the water supply system, wastewater management, waste management, all of these different infrastructure in the cities that kind of form this web. And the flow of information also, which is very, very important. But what happens is, if you can see what's on top of the screen where we talk about shocks and stresses, that is where I would like to draw your attention to, because let's start with stresses, because that is something that the cities experience due to the urbanization rate. And this could include things like depleting groundwater, or there's salinity intrusion, or there's inadequate waste management, or in general, there's depleting green cover. So these are some of the challenges that most cities in India face on a day-to-day basis. In addition to this, what we're looking at are these shocks. So shocks are one of these disasters, a one-time event, which could be a heat wave, which could be a cyclone, it could be a cloud outburst, maybe disease outbreaks, or even flooding. So this is sort of a one-off event that kind of disturbs the way a city functions. And stresses that we just discussed earlier are chronic in nature. So it can't be addressed in one go, but that is something we experience on a day-to-day basis. So the reason we are looking at it as shocks and stresses is very, very important, because the way the city is developed and the number of stresses that it has, in a way, can also determine how much the risk we have for these disasters per se. So like if I have to take an example of a heat wave, then if the city has, just as an example, if they have a lot of green cover, then there's a lot more respite for people to address the heat wave during those 3 days or a week and things like that. And in case, take an example of a flood, if the city does not have a good waste management sort of a system, and there's a lot of waste collected in multiple parts of the city, and especially in low-lying areas, then the flood water can get mixed with the waste, and there are chances for some disease outbreaks following the floods. So, but if that city had a good waste management system, then immediately you can tackle what's going to happen after the flood. So that is the reason we talk about stresses and shocks, and both of these need to be addressed at a city level for a city to become more resilient. That's what I'm elaborating a little bit more. So on your left, you see the acute shocks. Some more shocks have been elaborated here. And then on your right are the chronic stresses. So even things like aging infrastructure is also a problem, because again, during floods and things like that, there are possibilities that something can collapse, and which can lead to loss of life and even some sort of damages. So air quality is also a chronic stress that most cities face in India. So in a sense, when we talk with respect to resilience, a city's ability to maintain its essential functions, right, like supply of water, electricity, access to transport, or basic functions that a city basically has, is threatened by both acute shocks and chronic stresses, right? And this is something that we need to address if we want to build resilience in cities. So in that context, I will probably define what resilience is. The discussions that we have later is based on this particular definition. So basically, when we talk about resilience, it's about bouncing back and coming back better after some disturbance has happened. But when we talk about it with respect to cities, so this resilience is defined as the capacity of cities. And when we say cities, it includes individuals, which is you, me, and the community in general, institutions, businesses, and systems, all put together that we just discussed before as cities. So how they can survive, adapt, and thrive no matter the kind of chronic stresses and acute shocks that they experience. So irrespective of flood that may happen in a city, irrespective of a heat wave that may happen in a city, how we are able to continue with our day-to-day essential functions without getting disturbed is something the concept of resilience comes into play in that particular context. And this is again important because we talk about various concepts as we talk about sustainable development, we talk about resilience and disaster risk reduction. So I thought that this might be useful to kind of stress on what these different concepts are. So we've just discussed what resilience is, but maybe I'll just talk about the 4 other concepts and terminologies. One is mitigation. So I just mentioned that cities contribute globally around 70% of greenhouse gas emissions, which sort of exacerbate climate change, right? So that is mitigation, to avoid and reduce the pollution and emission of greenhouse gases. So the efforts that we may take towards that is mitigation basically. And when we talk about adaptation, is how we can adapt to our practices or maybe our assets and even our development to limit the impact of climate change. Basically, it can come in terms of these disasters that we're talking about. So how can we limit the impact of that? And now we can adapt to that as adaptation. And in a similar sort of lines, when we say disaster risk reduction, here we more focus on how we can reduce the damages that will be caused by disasters. So mostly focusing on the reduction of damage. There we look at as disaster risk reduction. And sustainable development is more in the sense of how we can develop. And this is also meeting the needs of the present requirements without compromising the ability of the future, basically. So kind of using renewable sources is the sort of path when we talk about sustainable development. So, so the shocks and stresses that we just discussed, it could be an opportunity for changing our path of development. So I think just if I can maybe give a couple of examples at this point. So the ongoing pandemic has also kind of shown how we need to sort of maybe develop keeping this particular scenario in mind. So a lot of the businesses are also thinking of going virtual and maybe working from home. So that is a new sort of a path of development that some of the companies may take. But if we have to look at it at a city level, one of the classic example I can give is from the 1850s in London, when there was a cholera outbreak. And I think one of the doctors identified a pump in one neighborhood that was sort of polluted and started this cholera outbreak. So that kind of revolutionized their reforms in sanitation and enhanced their sanitation system to ensure that this kind of sort of a outbreak or a shock does not occur in the city ever again. So that point, so that's what has been illustrated on the slide as a graph. So that point of a shock or a stress that disturbs the city can be, in a sense, an opportunity to change our path of development. So in that sense, I'm looking at it as an opportunity and how we can develop further from that direction. So at this point, what I'll do is I will take you all through some of the examples of what has been happening in the Indian context. So first, I'll just take you all quickly through how Surat has gone about developing a resilience strategy for the city. So Surat, of course, has floods, has disease outbreaks that it had to face in the last decade. So this also did affect many of their businesses. And that started as a starting point for the city to say how we can become more resilient to these disasters. So they started with the process of developing a resilience strategy in 2015, and now they have a strategy developed, and they've also implemented some of the measures that were identified in the strategy. So this is something two other cities in India also have done. We have Pune and Chennai that have developed their resilience strategy. And this is part of a global cohort called the 100 Resilient Cities, where 100 cities across the globe have followed the similar process of developing a strategy for their cities. So the process, of course, is to identify the different stakeholders who may be involved, identifying the city's context, doing a preliminary assessment of the kind of hazards that the city may face and what kind of impacts that has. And based on the stakeholder consultation, they do like a diagnostic, resilient diagnostic study. They identify the opportunity areas, and with multiple consultations, they identify sort of the initiatives. So some cities have taken the approach of identifying short, medium, and long-term sort of strategies, aligning to some of the work that they're already doing, so leveraging the ongoing work. But in the case of Surat, they've identified 7 pillars and like 63 initiatives that they think need to be done to make Surat more resilient. So I'll just touch upon some of the aspects of the strategy which would be useful. So this is the framework that the 100 resilient cities follow, and all the 100 cities across the globe referred to. So they had 4 verticals, which is health and well-being, economy and society, infrastructure and environment, and leadership and strategy, mostly covering the governance aspect, basically. And in health and well-being, it talks about all the basic services and the requirements in a particular city. And infrastructure and environment is pretty straightforward. We're talking about the communication aspects, the mobility aspect, and the other natural and man-made assets that may exist in the city. And when we talk about economy and society, it's about the economic growth, the businesses that's there, and how the city can focus more on economic prosperity and also social cohesion, because all of these put together is what can make a city more resilient per se. So following this framework, what Surat did, or rather all of the cities basically did, was they identified their strength and weakness across these different verticals. So in the case of Surat, they realized that housing is sort of a weakness that they need to address, but water supply is their strength. They have access to general healthcare, but emergency healthcare is something that they don't have. So identifying your strengths and weakness across these sectors is one of the ways that you can understand what you need to strengthen when you keep maybe flood in mind or disease outbreak in mind, things like that. And in addition to that, they also identified some of the active or the least active sectors. So say with respect to city development, the city realized that they have state and national level projects, ongoing projects that they can leverage. And they also have flood management studies that have already been conducted that they could leverage. But with respect to basic needs, they thought that the state level skill employment programs are very sort of limited. So maybe that is something that can be focused on. So it's a holistic sort of an approach to ensure that, no part of the city is sort of impacted in case of any shock or stress. So coming back to shock and stress, this is again a useful sort of an understanding to have. So on your left are all the shocks that the Surat has experienced or is projected to experience. And on your right are all the stresses that they identified. And they did this correlation, which is also like a high, moderate, and low correlation to understand, say in case of a say disease outbreak, then what are the triggers for it, or what is the correlation to the stresses that the city already is facing. So they felt that the highest correlation is from water pollution or maybe shortage, and maybe sort of a moderate correlation to the exposed critical infrastructure. And if I have to talk about maybe extreme rainfall, it's the same thing. They thought it's a high correlation to the depleting natural resources and of course water pollution. So all of these sort of aggravate their risks to these shocks that may occur. So this is a very useful exercise to keep in mind to understand the kind of risks that the city may face based on the existing conditions, basically. And these were the 7 pillars that the city identified that they thought that they need to strengthen further if they want to make the city more resilient. And all of this is also derived from the previous few slides that I just discussed and the exhaustive process that the city followed with consultations to see what needs to be focused on, why, where, and how, basically. So a similar process again was followed by Chennai and Pune in India specifically. And what I'll do now is quickly look at some of the other examples of how we can bring in resilience in some of the projects that the cities can take. I'll touch upon some of the international examples and some national level examples as well. So this is an example from Paris. The project is called Oasis Schoolyard. This is again part of their resilience strategy that they identified. So basically this city was facing 2 challenges. One is urban heat island effect and the risk of stormwater flooding. And the problem areas which kind of exaggerated the risk from these 2 sort of challenges were that they had quite a bit of impervious surfaces, and in comparison to the other cities in Europe, the green space per inhabitant was only 14.5 square meters, which is very, very low compared to the other cities in Europe. So they wanted to address these 2 problem areas and the challenges together. And the opportunity they found to address all of this is to address the schoolyard in the city schools. And so they realized that every citizen of their city basically lived no more than 200 meters from a schoolyard. And if we have to add all of the surfaces of the schoolyards, basically schoolyard is the open ground in the schools, that added up to 70 hectares of impervious surfaces and open air surfaces. So what they identified in the resilience strategy is that one of the interventions that they can do to address these challenges was to make these impervious surfaces of the schoolyards into pervious surfaces and maybe bring in more green cover. And that is something that they experimented in a couple of schools, and they found that there was a 10% decrease in the surface temperatures, and in the daytime air temperature also it was reduced by 1 to 3 degrees. And if we had to compare the water absorption, that increased by 4 to 16 mm. And they also decided to open the schoolyards for the immediate community. So in case of a heat wave and things like that, they could use this as respite. And in a way, these spaces also become community building areas. So they address multiple issues that the city was facing with one sort of an intervention. And because of the success of this particular project, they are planning to scale it up to all of the other schools in the city. So this is a very small sort of an intervention, but having an understanding of what your shocks are, what your stresses are, and what interventions will create the greater impact is something that cities can start thinking about in that sense. This is another example in Chennai. So of course, Chennai, all of us know, does face a lot of issues with respect to water and extreme sort of conditions, either flooding or cyclone or lack of water, drinking water. So looking at their water systems is something that the city is strongly looking at. They have rejuvenated quite a few lakes, and they're also looking at the water systems to see how they can rejuvenate some of them to make sure that the risk that they face from flooding can be reduced. So this is one such example, which is the Adyar Punga Eco Park in Chennai. So this is a 58-acre creek by Adyar Creek that was sort of rejuvenated by the Chennai River Restoration Trust. So they had all the interventions that we know basically, right? So you have to desilt and excavate, you have to arrest the sewage discharge that's coming into the water and divert it into sewer pipelines, and make sure your biodiversity. How do you bring in enhance your biodiversity? By identifying the species, local species, planting those mangroves and aquatic plants is something that they focused on. So they did this on one part of the creek, and they did realize that the number of amphibians and the reptiles and birds that came back to that creek, the eco park, increased, and that itself is a testimonial for that the eco park has been rejuvenated. So the solutions are there, but it's just the matter of how you bring in different people to work together to implement it is something that needs to be stressed further and further on. This is another interesting example. This is in Netherlands. This is in the city of Rotterdam. They call this as a water square because they did kind of address the water stagnation and flooding issues in some of the low-lying areas. The city itself is lower to the sea level, so they have extensive measures that they have taken by building barrages and things like that to ensure that they don't flood. But this is a very small intervention that they have done in multiple parts of the city. So again, they have identified squares which can be converted into water squares. So this is a larger infrastructure sort of a project combined with a public space wherein they do collect a lot of as a stormwater in their tanks in these areas. So the purpose of the square kind of changes depending on the condition. So you do have, when there is a cloud outburst, the way it looks is what you see on your left. So it becomes more like a tank where the water is stored. And on your right, what you have is it becomes a public space. So this is something that we can draw relevance to our temple tanks and things like that we have in India as well. There are many water structures in many cultures in India as well, historically, which have looked at using these spaces as public spaces. And this is sort of a similar sort of an approach, but with a larger infrastructure in mind that the city sort of developed. And this is again interesting ways of addressing a particular problem. It's not just flooding, but is also trying to build the communities and give them more spaces, public spaces, to bring the communities together and enhance their quality of life in that sense. This is another interesting example of Rio de Janeiro. So there they have it's very similar to our ICCC, the Integrated Command and Control Centers in our cities. And I should say that in the COVID time, many of these cities did use their ICCC as their COVID war rooms because it was easier to monitor and communicate with various people for the management purpose. And this is something that in Rio that they have done is they have issues of flooding and landslides in most of their informal settlements. And they realized that to communicate that if something were to happen, that information gap is something that they had to address immediately if they wanted to save the loss of lives. So they did have the support system and they connected various departments through this. And even the predictions were easily conveyed and issue warnings to the citizens were conveyed through this particular sort of an approach. And this is just a starter of having to communicate with the citizens if there is a flood or a landslide. But establishing these systems will also be helpful to manage during a disaster and maybe even after a disaster for rehabilitation, just because of having that coordination and communication system set in place is something we can also start looking at. And there are many cities in India which are looking at ICCC to go beyond the way of just collecting data and how to move forward beyond to convert that into sort of a decision-making process for developing better in their cities. So I'll just take another more minutes to quickly take you all through the Climate Smart Cities Assessment Framework that I mentioned earlier. So this is the framework that the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs launched. The idea was to see how Indian cities are developing, but from a climate lens. So like the way you looked at the examples, right? So rejuvenating a creek is something important, and the infrastructure, looking at the impervious surfaces and converting them to pervious surfaces is something that you can, in simple interventions that you can take to reduce the risk of flooding. So what I'm trying to drive here is that any project that a city takes, if they can just try to make it more resilient, then by mainstreaming that in those projects itself, then that itself solves a lot of the problems. Because for a city to build resilience, it doesn't need to take special projects. It just need to strengthen each and every work that is already happening in the cities, keeping the disaster in mind, keeping the climate change in mind, basically. So it is in that context that this framework also was launched, where we're looking at these 5 different thematic areas of mobility and air quality, waste management, water management, urban planning, green cover, biodiversity, and energy and green buildings, to see how the cities are developing in each of these sectors. And if we have to bring in the climate lens, then where do they stand? So this 2 rounds of this assessment has been done. In the first round in 2019, 100 cities participated. And in 2020, last year, we had 126 cities across the country that participated in this particular assessment. And this is just a nudge for the cities to understand this is where you are, and these are your challenges, and this is how you need to proceed basically to progress and become more climate resilient in that particular sense. So here I would just maybe draw your attention to 3 or 4 indicators. So under water management, we have flood, water stagnation, and risk management. That is something that the cities, we are assessing the kind of actions that they have taken to look at the flood management. We have a specific indicator under urban planning, green cover, and biodiversity that looks at disaster.
Madam Vashwini, you're not audible. We lost your voice. Anil sir, am I audible to you?
Yes, you are audible.
If you would please call Vashni ma'am and let her know that her voice is not audible. Maybe her internet connection is lost. I would request the participants to kindly wait for 2 to 3 minutes. Vashwini ma'am has lost her internet connection. She will soon be joining us. Till the time, if you have any questions or queries, you can post in the chat box, which can be taken up later by Madam Vashwini.
Nitika ma'am will be connecting in 2 minutes.
Yes, she has already joined. Vashwini ma'am, please unmute yourself.
Yeah, sure. Let me also just share my screen once again. So sorry, there was a small blip in the internet connection here.
Right, ma'am. Ma'am, what you can do is to save your bandwidth, you can disable your video.
I'll do that, yeah. So I was talking about the Climate Smart Cities Assessment Framework. So of course, considering we did this across 126 cities, this does impact over 1/3 of our urban population. And the framework is also designed in a way that it can help cities to document their contribution to the SDGs and India's nationally determined contributions as well. And interestingly, the framework also has development-wise indicators. So in a way, it not only tells the city where they are, but it also gives them direction as to how they need to progress. If I can maybe just illustrate how that is being done. So if you look at this indicator on disaster resilience that I mentioned, so basically, the first thing that a city needs to do is make sure that it has a disaster management cell or an emergency operations center, whatever they call it, at the city level, basically. And then to see if this has been established and if they are doing regular mock drills and disaster response, so all of the activities that the cell needs to do, that would be a second step. And of course, the third next is to conduct studies to determine the hazard risk vulnerability of the cities, to identify the hotspots, and eventually to go ahead and develop a city level disaster management plan. So, there is a district level disaster management plan, but considering more and more the cities are at the brunt of facing these disasters, and they need to start looking at a city level management plan as well. So that is something that we are looking at how cities can start working towards. And then sort of more advanced stages of how the cities can start building disaster resilience is to establish an early warning system, to see how they can link it with their ICCC, like the example of Rio that we were just looking at, so they can better monitor and manage emergency situations. And of course, moving forward is to start implementing a lot of the measures that have been identified and start monitoring and updating their disaster management plan. And looking at implementation, like maybe some building bylaws they need to look at, especially when you want to look at reducing GHG emissions. So the kind of changes you may need to bring in your building bylaws or any departmental sort of plans to mitigate risks. So to what extent they're able to take some of the actions on that end is something that we're looking at cities in the more advanced sort of levels. So this is a nudge for the cities basically to start thinking, okay, we stand here and we need to move forward. So if you'll also see the performance of the cities, like I said, we had 126 cities that participated in 2020. And they've also been able to show progress from the previous year's assessment with the kind of work that the cities may start looking at. So as an holistic sort of an approach, this framework also gives them an idea of which of the areas that they need to prioritize and focus on if they want to become more climate resilient per se. So this is available on our website in case you all want to take a look at more in detail. And so with this, I would like to end the session. But I think as key takeaways, what I would like to just remind all of you is, like even the previous speaker mentioned, that the disasters are going to increase and our weather is changing with, it's going to be very erratic in nature. And we have to start looking at mitigating our greenhouse gases as well. So considering all of these three things, keeping in mind, and cities as the centers of having to face the brunt of it and also contribute to these changes, it is very, very important that we start focusing on, mainstreaming resilience in the cities. So I hope this has been sort of a helpful sort of a presentation for everyone. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them now. Over to you, Nitika. Thank you.
Ms. Vashmini, I want to use this note to thank you for that extraordinary presentation that you gave. It was simple yet extraordinarily profound and effective. Thank you very much for such a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. With this note, I would request the participants, if they are with any questions, they may feel free to write in the chat box, and also they can raise their hands, for which I will unmute them, and they can put up their question directly to Madam Vashmini. Once again, I earnestly request all the participants to avail this opportunity of having interaction with the key speaker. Ma'am, any question you can see directly to you in your chat box?
No, I don't have anything that I see on my chat box.
Ma'am, the question which I have got in my chat box is, the question is, are the development measures responsible for the occurrence of more of disasters?
Could you repeat that? Sorry, I didn't get your question clearly.
Are the development measures more cause of recurring disasters or more of disasters?
So not necessarily all of the development, but if in case there is, say, sort of a low-lying area which is already having water stagnation on a regular basis, then having any development around there is something that can be restricted. And in case if you want to look at the depleting green cover, so the cities can also start looking at guarding some of the areas, saying this is something that we don't develop on and things like that. So just being very conscious in that sense of what areas can be developed or not, depending on the disasters, is something that the cities can start looking at. But in case if that is something not taken into consideration, then they do experience a lot more risk from such disasters compared to the other parts of the city. So in that sense, to a certain extent, it does aggravate the risks. But of course, keeping all of those in mind is what we're trying to say that the cities need to start looking at.
Thank you, Madam Vashmini. And one small request, we're getting requests from the participant side. If you could please share the soft copy of your presentation. Ma'am, please share it with Mr. Anil, and I'll share it with the participants.
All right. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for being with us. Now coming on to the third and the last session of the day, titled Hazard and Risks of Climate Change, I would like to welcome Mr. Anil Kathar. Mr. Anil has recently joined as junior consultant with NIDM, earlier to which he was young professional at Center for Hill Area Development, Geometeorological Risks Management Division, NIDM. He has penned 20 research papers on various aspects of landslides, hazard mitigation and management, contributing in drafting the engineering guidelines on landslide mitigation measures for Indian roads. Mr. Anil, may I please request you to kindly begin with your session. Mr. Anil, over to you.
Thanks, Nikita, for giving me this opportunity. I hope I am audible.
Yes, sir, you're audible, sir.
Give me a couple of seconds to share my screen.
Yes, sir, your screen is visible to us. You may continue, please.
Okay, so once again, thank you very much. And a very good afternoon to all the panelists and the participants. And the topic I will be discussing is hazard and risk of climate change. Climate change, as you all know, is today's most debatable topic. Hazards and what option do we have to curb the impact of climate change? So weather and climate. Weather, when you see weather is the condition of the atmosphere at a particular location and movement. And when you talk about climate, climate is a collective state of the atmosphere for a given place over a specified intervals of time. And weather refers to short atmospheric condition, while climate is the weather of a specific region averaged over a long period of time. And this climate, it can be defined based on the location, time, and average of extreme variables like location. Climate can be defined for a on the basis for globe, or it can be defined for a continent or a region or a city. And when you talk about the it's an element about time, climate must be defined over a period of specific interval. And this National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, typically they use a 30 years average to define this climate. And whereas studying this Earth's history often involves average of century, or it can be longer than century. So this the term climate change, it was first put in the public domain by a US scientist named Wallach Smith in the year 1975. And coming to the definition of how we can define this climate change, what is climate change? So according to United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, it is an international environmental treaty that was adopted in year 1992, and it entered in force in 94. According to UNFCCC, climate change, it is a change that can be attributed directly, or it can be attributed indirectly to human activities that alter the composition of the global atmosphere, and which in addition to a natural climate variability observed on comparable time periods. And there are many international organizations have given their own set of definition about the climate change, like there is Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, and according to them, a change in the state of climate that can be identified by change in the mean or the variability of its property that persists for an extended period, typically it decades or longer. So according to them, that is climate change. And this International Panel on Climate Change is the intergovernmental body of United Nations for assessing the science related to climate change, and it was formed in year 1988. So global warming and climate change, Punya ma'am has also discussed this term global warming and climate change. People often treat the global warming and climate change as synonyms. Basically, global warming is just an aspect of climate change. When you talk about global warming, it refers to the rise in global temperature due to mainly due to increasing concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Basically, it is the long-term heating of Earth's climate system observes this. You can see pre-industrial period. Pre-industrial period is basically the time period between 1850 to 1900, and this heating can be due to human activities like fossil fuel burning, which increase the heat trapping greenhouse gases level in the Earth's atmosphere. And basically, this warming occurs when this carbon dioxide, CO2, and the other air pollutants collect in the atmosphere and absorb sunlight. They absorb solar radiation that have bounced off the Earth's surface. Normally, this radiation would escape into the space, but these pollutants, CO2 and other air pollutants, which can last for years to centuries in the atmosphere, trap the heat, and they cause the planet to get hotter. So this heat trapping pollutants specifically like I mentioned, carbon dioxide, methane, then there is nitrous oxide, there is synthetic fluorinated gases. These are which are also known as greenhouse gases, and their impact is known as a greenhouse effect. On the other hand, when you talk about this climate change refers to the increasing changes in the measures of climate over a long period of time, and it include precipitation, then there is temperature, then there is wind patterns, and human anthropogenic activities are more specifically the greenhouse gas emission due to human activities or anthropogenic activities are the leading cause of Earth's rapidly changing climate. And apart from this anthropogenic activities, there are some natural forces that can also contribute to climate change, like sun's intensity, then there is a volcanic eruption, as well as change in the naturally occurring greenhouse gas concentration. But records indicate that today's what we are seeing, the climatic warming, particularly that which have occurred since the mid 20th century, it is happening at much faster rate than ever before, and it can be explained by, and it can't be explained by natural causes. Like according to NASA, these natural causes are still play. It's still they are play into today. They are play in play, but their influence is too small, or they can occur too slowly to explain the rapid warming seen in this recent years. So, how we are so sure that our climate is changing. There are a lot of signs of changing climate, like temperature are rising. There is episodes of extreme droughts, rising of temperature are rising worldwide, and due to greenhouse gas are trapping more heat in the atmosphere. Like according to World Meteorological Organization, the average global temperature in 2019 was around 1.1 degrees Celsius. That was above the pre-industrial period. And according to them, since 1980s, each successive decade has been warmer than the last. Then there is droughts. Droughts are becoming longer. They are becoming more extreme around the world. Tropical, when you talk about tropical storms are becoming more severe due to warmer ocean and warmer ocean water temperature. And as the temperature rises, there is less snow pack in mountain ranges and polar areas. And apart from that, the snow also melts at faster rates. So overall, glaciers are melting at a faster rates. Then there is sea ice in this Arctic Ocean around our North Pole is melting faster with the warmer temperature. Permafrost is melting, realizing really that consequently that is releasing methane, that is a powerful greenhouse gas into the atmosphere. Sea levels are rising, that are threatening our coastal communities, that are also threat to our coastal ecosystem. So these are some of the signs which indicate that climate is changing at a rapid rate. So now the question is this climate change, which is most debated topic in today's time, is it a new concept? So the answer is no. Climate change has always been happen on the Earth, which is clearly seen in this geological record. And why we are so worried about it? It is the rapid rate and the magnitude of climate change occurring now that is a great concern worldwide. Human activities has increased, like I mentioned, the anthropogenic activities has increased more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere since the industrial revolution, that leading to more heat retention and increase in the surface temperature. And also the other causes that you can see is the land use changes due to urbanization or deforestation have also led to change in the amount of sunlight that is reflected from the background in the space. So now, how the changing climate scenario is affecting us, is affecting our ecosystem. What are the impacts of the changing scenarios, climate scenarios on the hazards, its vulnerabilities? See, due to climate change, frequency of extreme weather events, whether you talk about floods or you take the example of droughts or heat waves, they are expected to increase in the future. And by altering the frequency, by altering their intensity of hazard event, affecting vulnerability to hazards or changing exposure to patterns, the changing climatic scenario is increasing the disaster risk. So it can increase the hazard while at the same time decrease the resilience, and the risk created by climate change can be slow in their onset. For example, you can take example of such changes in the temperature and changes in the precipitation. These are on the slow side of climate change, and they can also be more sudden impact, like a tropical storm, like a flood, or there is flood floods. So risks that are associated with weather-related hazard is disproportionately concentrated, and their concentration is disproportionate in developing countries, and within these countries, the poorer section, the poorer sector of the population, poverty, you can constrained access to that society that have constrained access to productive assets, that the rural livelihoods that depend on the agriculture or other natural resources are vulnerable to even slight variation in the weather and seasonality. So what are the response options for climate change? So typically in climate change assessment, risk is considered as a combination. It is a combination of hazard, vulnerability, and exposure. So this is the approach that is used by IPCC, and you can take for a simple example, extreme heat. Extreme heat is hazard that poses a risk to rail infrastructure through its heat tolerance. That is what you call vulnerability, and its location. Location is its exposure. But response to climate change also affect risk. Like look at the local biodiversity. For example, planting trees could be a great threat to habitat loss as drought itself. And tree planting and drought can interact to increase risk of intense wildfire, further harming biodiversity. And so some decision can have negative unintended consequences, but they can also have multiple benefits. So take an example like switching from fossil fuels to renewable energy will limit global warming and prevent billions of premature deaths that are caused by air pollution. A more unified risk framework recognize how this happens. Now coming to the India and the hazard vulnerability. As you know, India is one of the highly disaster-prone country in the world, and due to its unique geoclimatic and socioeconomic attributes, India has marked as one of the highly vulnerable country to different hazards in the world map. It is prone to earthquake, it is prone to landslide, then there is flood, drought, coastal areas are prone to cyclones. More than 50% of our landmass is vulnerable to moderate to high intensity of seismic hazard, and being one of the youngest mountain range in the world, the Himalayan region, which lies in high intensity of earthquake zone, then around 21 odd states and 4 union territories of a country are prone to landslides. Landslide hazard. Our Himalayan region and Western Ghats are among the highly landslide affected areas. Then around whatever the ecological condition, along with this monsoon precipitation and other factors have fabricated over 1/8 of geographical area of our country prone to floods and as well as river erosion. Coming to the coastal coastal region, India has a coastal line of around more than 7,000 length, out of which around 5,000 and something is kilometer is coastline is vulnerable to cyclones and tsunamis. Then there is drought. Drought affects nearly 68% of our arable areas in the country with varying magnitude, and they have diverse impact depending upon the location. And this disaster events incurred due to hazards have caused us enormous loss in terms of lives, in terms of economy. They have also devastated our ecosystem, and as per estimate, around 2% of our GDP is lost due to adverse impacts of disaster. As you can see in the background image, this figure is taken from UN report that is titled as Human Cost of Disaster. And according to this report, India has reported 321 disaster, and these disasters were reported between 2 decades from 2000 to 2019. And India stands third after China and America for this period in terms of reported disaster. And this factor shows the degree of vulnerability of India for the different disasters. This chart is taken from World Bank group study, and according to World Bank group, India faces some of the highest disaster risk levels in the world, and India ranked 29 out of 191 odd countries by 2019 informed risk index. And India has a very high, India is very highly exposed to flooding. Like my previous speaker has also mentioned that over 140 cities of India are prone to very high risk to flooding. And flooding, it include riverine floods, it include flash floods, it includes coastal floods in coastal region, as well as a high exposure to tropical cyclone, their associated hazards and droughts. And disaster risk in India is also driven by its social vulnerability. India's vulnerability ranking is around, it is 44 out of 190 odd states. And this charts, like I mentioned, it belongs to the research work that was conducted by World Bank, and it provides an overview of the most frequent natural disasters in India. And like you can see after year 2002 to 2004, it is showing more columns of gray color, which indicate that there was more episodes of floods in the country. As also this United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, floods are on average the greatest source of annual loss to disaster in India, that costing an estimate of around 7 billion every year. And during the 20th century, flood hazard increased across a majority of the states in India, and the implication of this journal trends towards more intense extreme precipitation events, and which are serious for potential more future flood extent. And there is projection points towards an increase in summer monsoon precipitation. However, this snow melt and glacier melt as a result of climate change it will also cause change in the timing of river peak. That means peaking in early spring or diminishing in the summer, and the year-to-year variability of monsoon rainfall will also, there will be also variability in the monsoon rainfall. that will contribute to a greater frequency of floods and droughts and lower recharge rates of groundwater reservoir. As you can see all over the India, this September month has broken all the precipitation record all over the country. And according to the projection, the northwestern region of the India is projected to see an increase in drought in the future, and eastern region is expected to see an increase in the length of dry spells. Further, this changing scenario of climate is expected to interact with cyclone hazard in complex ways, and like known risks that include action of sea level rise to enhance the damage caused by this cyclone-induced storm surge, and there is possibility of increased wind speed and precipitation, and as well as their mitigation. So what are the options with us for addressing the problem of climate change? So we have two options. Either we can go with mitigation, or either we can go with adaptation. So mitigation, as defined by IPCC, it is an anthropogenic intervention. Basically, it is to reduce the anthropogenic forcing of the climate system. It includes strategies to reduce greenhouse gas sources and their emissions, and side by side enhancing greenhouse gas sinks. For example, for mitigation, we need to develop new low energy technology for industry and for our transport system. We can reduce consumption of energy intensive products, and we can also switch the renewable forms of energy such as solar and wind power. Then there is adaptation. Adaptation, basically, it is adjustment in nature or human system in response to actual or expected climate stimuli or their effects, and which moderates harm. Adaptation doesn't eliminate or the risk, it actually moderates the harms or exploits beneficial opportunities. And for example, adaptation, you can adapt to the climatic conditions by preparing a risk assessment, by protecting your ecosystem, by improving your agriculture methods, managing water resources, or building a settlement in safe zones, or you can go for early warning to develop early warning system, or instituting better building design, improving insurance coverage. Also, you can develop society safety nets, and as well as enhancing the public awareness and enhancing the quality of education of our community against the climate change, against these impacts of climate change, and the strategies and mitigation adaptation strategies for a resilient community. So if you wish to have a resilience against this changing climate change, we need to adopt appropriate mitigation. We need to adopt appropriate adaptation strategies, and it is also important that whatever strategies we adopt, that should be revised this time to time. Our strategies should be updated as per the current situation. Like you can take an example of a pencil. A pencil is useful until unless it is resharpened. If pencil is not resharpened, it cannot be used further after it is used. Likewise, we need to resharpen our strategies. We need to update our strategies as per the current situation. So with this, thank you, and back to you, Nitika.
Thank you, Mr. Anil, for your presentation with us. It was a very wonderful presentation. Thank you for making us aware of the hazard and the climate change. Thank you very much. With this, I would request the participants, if they are with any questions, they can write to us, and also they can raise their hands. So I can see one hand raised. It's by Prabjot Kaur. I don't know whether she has raised it now or it was earlier. Madam Prabjot, you may please unmute yourself if you want to raise a question. Sir, any questions directed to you in your chat box here?
Let me check.
Yes, sir.
No, ma'am, there is no message directed to me.
Okay, sir. So then we may conclude our today's session, sir.
Sure.
Thank you very much once again, Anil sir. Thank you very much. So with this, our today's session concludes. I would like to place a special thanks to the key speakers of today, Dr. Purnima Jalihal, Ms. Vaishni Shankar, and Mr. Anil Kathat for their insightful and wonderful sessions on board. Also, special thanks to all of you for sitting through these sessions and showing keen interest in the topic. Now it's the time to say you goodbye. Let's meet tomorrow at the same time with some more interesting sessions. Kindly join in time. Thank you once again for your patient listening. Jai Hind.